There have been lots of conversations recently about E10 fuel, and this is because in the UK in the last few weeks, most petrol stations have been changing their standard unleaded fuel to E10 and their premium over to E5. This just means that E10 contains 10% ethanol and E5 contains 5% ethanol. E10 itself isn't particularly new, it's been around in the US for decades, so with its mainstream introduction in the UK, there's been some level of panic and misinformation going on. And that's why I wanted to make this video, just to clarify a few things and demystify some information that's out there. Certain things you read will say, for example, that old cars will be damaged by E10. And that's quite a relative way of looking at it, because what is an old car? You know, someone who changes their car every 2 years for a new car might consider a 5-year-old car old. And someone else may have a 25-year-old car and consider it fairly new. So the term old doesn't really help, and damage to the car, well, we need to understand what parts are being affected. So that's what we'll take a look at. As I mentioned, E10 has been around in the US for decades, so this does vary as well based on where your vehicle was manufactured, whether it was Europe or Japan, for example. So if you do the same thing, then you should hopefully find some more information around it. So here I have the original owner's manual for this Chevy pickup truck, and this was a 1980 model, so it was made from 1979 onwards. So this gives us a benchmark as to the information in here is applicable from at least 1979. It could go back a few more years. It'd be great to find an older version of this. So if we open this up and we look at the fuel section, there's a paragraph here on gasohol, and gasohol here is gasoline and ethanol. So it says, you may use gasohol in your vehicle provided it is no more than 10% ethanol. In other words, you may use E10 in this vehicle. And it says here about octane rating, just making sure that the octane rating is the same. If there are issues with the different octane level, then to switch back. So effectively, you know, a 41, 42-year-old vehicle can be run on E10 based on the owner's manual there. So, and that's why I say look at your own vehicle's one, because it will be different based on the vehicle of the location of the vehicle manufacturer. So now there are some caveats around this. So this was, you know, for someone who just bought this vehicle new and they're going to be using it regularly. And that's where E10 comes into play more. So E10 starts to show its traits after longer periods of times, in terms of if you leave E10 fuel sat in a fuel tank for several months, that's when you'll start to notice the difference. Whereas on a regularly used vehicle, it won't really show up. So what we mean by that is E10 being 10% ethanol, it's hygroscopic. It brings moisture from the atmosphere, it attracts it to the fuel, and then what happens is that water, being heavier than the fuel, will sink to the bottom of the fuel tank and start to encourage corrosion. And that does the same in the carburetor as well. So that's one of the issues with E10, is that it's attracting moisture to the fuel lines, to the carb, to the fuel tank. So that's why when they wrote this, obviously this was for vehicles that were used regularly. People still use 1980 Chevys daily and regularly, but there are people that will use these, and of course other GM vehicles, that will use them as, you know, maybe a show car or just for occasional use. So it may sit for several weeks, several months. It may not move over the entire winter for, say, 6 months. And that's when E10 starts to show itself more. So if you're going to do that, then you've got two options really with the fuel. You either drain the fuel tank, or you put some fuel stabiliser in it. So if you're going to use the car maybe once a month, then use some fuel stabiliser. If you're going to let it sit for a long time, then drain the tank. So that's something, while it says it can run on E10, that's for regular use. If it's irregular, then start to take other measures. And the other thing to look at is, so we've looked at the fuel tank, and then getting the fuel from the tank to the engine, we have fuel line. So fuel line is rubber compounds. They are different depending on what spec you get. So that's what we'll take a look at. Again, because I've seen people say just buy a modern high pressure fuel line and it will be fine, because the thinking there is, well, it's modern, it's designed to work with all sorts of fuels. Yes and no. It really depends on the spec. So here's the example. So these are the same inner diameter, 3/8, 9.5 millimeter inner diameter, but you'll see the fuel pressure hose is a lot larger on the outside, so it can deal with that extra pressure. This is 150 psi rated, and which is 10 bar, and this is low pressure fuel line, so this will be fine, I don't know, for let's say 15-20 psi. But the point here is, this is an old line, low pressure, and this is fine for E10, but this isn't, even though this is brand new. So if you just call up a place and you ask for high pressure fuel line thinking it will be fine, the use of high pressure is irrelevant. This is what you need, the SAE rating. So SAE stands for Society of Automotive Engineers, and they have this J30 R6, or in this case J30 R7. So really just look at the R number, so R6, R7. If you look at the spec, you can go to a manufacturer's website and have a look at what R6 is good for. It's good for E5. R7 is good for E10. So that's why, even though this is brand new high pressure fuel line, I wouldn't use this. And this older carb fuel line can be used because it's R7, so this is good for E10. So look at the spec of the fuel hose. And so that's something. So while you can drain your fuel tank or put some fuel stabiliser in it, the rubber lines are affected by the composition of the fuel going through them from the inside. And E10 will eat away more at R6 than it will R7. So obviously rubber products decay over time anyway, so I wouldn't imagine you'd want to use a fuel line for too long. So you would want to, as part of your regular service and maintenance, just keep an eye on them, look for cracks, anything like that, and then just make sure they're in good condition and replace them with at least R7. So that's in terms of the fuel lines there. So again, I've seen lots of misinformation about this. So just make sure you've got the correctly rated R7 or above. And just something to mention there, so the bigger number isn't always better. So you've got R9, which is good for E85, so you can have up to 85% ethanol content with R9 fuel hose. You can also get E10, but you wouldn't want to use that. Normally you would buy, if you were redoing the rubber lines in your car, you would buy a certain length, 2 meters, 10 feet, whatever, and then you just cut that up into pieces and use that in the various run from the fuel tank up to the carb. R6, R7 and R9 are designed to carry E5, E10, E85 and be used for underhood temperatures. So they're fine for high temperatures. They won't break down because of temperature. If you have R10, I can't remember the ethanol rating it carries, but say it carries E85, it won't deal with underhood temperatures. So it will break down because of the heat, not because of the fuel in there. So it's just a bit of advice on bigger number isn't always better. Just make sure you go for R7 or R9, because R6 is only good for E5 and R10 is not for underhood temperatures. It's fine, you can put R10 hose in the fuel tank if you have a fuel pump and you need to run the hose up through the tank so it's submerged inside and outside. It's fine for that, but it won't deal with temperature. It will break down. So that's important to know as well. So hopefully that's offered some clarity. So if you're going to let the car sit for a long period of time, either fuel stabiliser or drain the tank. For infrequent use, fuel stabiliser, and just make sure that the hoses are at least R7, ideally R9, and just make sure they're in good condition as well, because if you have R7 hose and it's 20 years old, it probably wants replacing anyway. So just keep an eye on the condition as well as the spec. And there are a few other things. I didn't want to make the video too long, but you also want to look at so again, this was for a stock setup. So this is with a quadrajet carb. So if you then change to an aftermarket carb, that may be different. So for example, an Edelbrock carb is an aluminium body, and that may face a high level of corrosion where the moisture is being attracted, and then it's creating that sort of fine white corrosion that aluminium can get. And I think Holly carbs have a zinc coating to them as well, which E10 could affect. So it's worth just looking those up depending on what carb you have. Again, if your car is stock and the manual says it's fine for it, then provided you're doing the same precautions with everything else, you'll be okay. And that's kind of it really. So just don't panic, just look into some facts, read some specs. You've got a fuel tank, fuel lines, a carb or fuel injection, and that's the system you just need to look for and understand what's going on there. So hopefully this offers some clarity, a bit less panic, and helps you make the right decisions on what to do. Obviously it's your vehicle, you do what you want with it, but hopefully this just offers some direction and some advice on some of the things to look at, and then you can sort of decide from there kind of what the best way forward is.